If this story hits you the way it hit me, smash that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. It might just change how they see the people they take for granted. She pointed at me in front of 200 people and said, "That's my ex-husband. No college degree, no real future. But he does plant a lovely flower bed." Then she waited for the laugh. She got it. Her father almost fell out of his chair. I stood near the bar with a glass of champagne I no longer wanted, and I made a decision I'd already been preparing for 3 weeks. I raised my glass in her direction, caught her eye just long enough for her to understand, and said, "You'll never see me again." Then I walked across that marble floor and out through the lobby doors, and I didn't look back once. My name is Marcus Hale. I'm 44 years old, and I want to tell you what happened before that party and everything that happened after. I started out as a landscape designer 2 decades ago. The kind of work that leaves dirt under your fingernails and calluses on your palms, not the sort of career that earns you respect at dinner parties. I designed gardens for suburban families, planted trees along residential streets, learned the soil and the seasons by hand. But I also learned the business side. I learned how contracts work, how to negotiate, how to build relationships with people who had money to spend on greenery. I saved carefully. I reinvested. Over the years, what began as a one-man operation expanded into something I never expected it to become. Commercial nurseries supplying hotel chains across 3 states, contracts with convention centers and corporate campuses, a full staff, and a revenue stream substantial enough to make a very comfortable life. Nobody knew because I never felt the need to announce it. That wasn't who I was. Vivian knew, or she should have. We'd been married for 12 years. She worked in advertising, built herself up from junior account executive to senior to, finally, partner at one of the better boutique agencies downtown. Last month, she earned that partnership. I was proud of her. I told her me pareja that morning. I meant it completely. The promotion party was held at the Riverside Grand Ballroom, the kind of venue with crystal chandeliers and white tablecloths pressed tight as a military fold, where the steak costs $40 and nobody blinks. Vivian's parents, Gerald and Patricia, had secured seats near the front and were already working through their 3rd drinks by the time the speeches began. They'd never warmed to me. I didn't have a degree. I didn't work in an office. I didn't fit the version of success they'd imagined for their daughter. I tolerated their coolness because Vivian loved them, and that was enough. The speeches started around 8. Her boss went first, smooth and practiced, talking about vision and execution and the direction of the agency under Vivian's leadership. Then Vivian stood up. The room settled immediately. She held her champagne flute loosely, like a woman accustomed to being listened to, and she spoke with a confidence I had once genuinely admired. "I want to thank everyone for being here," she said. "This moment means everything to me. It confirms what I've always believed, that ambition is worth it, that the climb is worth every sacrifice." Applause. I clapped along with everyone else, standing near the bar, tasting the sweetness of a drink I didn't really want. Then she turned slightly toward my side of the room, not quite at me, more past me, as though I were a prop she was incorporating, and said, "I'd also like to introduce you all to my ex-husband." The room went quiet for 1 full second. No college degree, no real future, but he does do lovely work with a trowel. Laughter moved through the crowd. Not explosive, more like the polite, well-practiced kind that people produce when they want to seam in on the joke without actually knowing the joke. Vivian's boss smiled at her the way bosses smile at clever people. 2 of her colleagues exchanged a look I recognized, and Gerald, her father, slapped his knee and wheezed like he'd been waiting for exactly that. Patricia covered her mouth with her hand, but her eyes sparkled with it. I stood completely still, one hand in my jacket pocket, the other holding a glass of champagne I set down carefully on the bar behind me. She wasn't looking at me. That was the detail that settled everything. Not the words. I could have endured the words. But she wasn't even looking at me while she said them. I was a punchline she'd already moved past, already performing her next line while the last one still hung in the air. I counted to 3, the way you count before you do something you've been preparing for a long time. Then I picked up my glass, raised it toward her until she finally looked at me. Just long enough. Cheers, I said, at a volume the nearest tables could hear. You'll never see me again. I walked out. No scene, no raised voice, just the sound of my shoes on polished stone and the jazz band that started up again before I'd even reached the lobby. The laughter faded behind me as I pushed through the doors into the cool night. I got in my car, opened the glove box, took out the envelope I'd been keeping there for 3 weeks. Then I drove to the 24-hour FedEx 2 miles away and dropped it in the overnight box. Inside that envelope were documents that had been notarized and finalized for most of a month. Vivian thought that night was the beginning of everything she'd worked toward. She had no idea it was the end of everything else. She came home around midnight, carried in on a wave of champagne and congratulations. The house was dark. She called my name once, then again. Then she turned on lights and walked from room to room. And then she reached the bedroom and saw my side of the closet. Empty, just bare hangers swaying slightly in the conditioned air. She pulled open the dresser drawers. Empty, no socks, no watches, not even the small ceramic dish where I kept my keys and my ring. The ring was gone, the dish was gone. On the nightstand, folded once, was a sheet of paper. You called me your ex tonight. Congratulations, you were right. The house is yours, all of it. Every mortgage payment, every repair bill, every problem that comes with it. My name has been removed from both the mortgage and the deed. Check your email for documentation. All joint accounts have been divided. My portion has been transferred. Do not try to find me. No signature, no explanation beyond what was already written. She called me immediately, straight to voicemail. She called 47 times over the next 3 days. Every single call went to the same recording. She texted, she emailed, she even sent a message through LinkedIn, which I found almost impressive in its desperation. On Thursday morning, she drove out to the nursery, 10 acres of greenhouses on the edge of the city, a place she'd visited exactly twice in 12 years. The receptionist, a woman named Kelly who'd been with the business for 4 years, looked up when she walked in and recognized her with something other than warmth. Is Marcus available? Vivian asked. Mr. Hale is no longer with the company, Kelly said. The silence lasted a beat. He owns it. He sold his controlling interest 3 weeks ago. The new ownership structure took effect Monday. Mr. Hale is pursuing other ventures. 3 weeks ago. He'd been planning this for 3 weeks. Where he'd gone, Kelly didn't say. The conversation ended without warmth or further information. Vivian sat in her car in the parking lot, opened the banking app on her phone, and found an email her account manager had sent 2 days before the party. Clean and professional. Attached documents for account separation and asset division. Investment accounts she hadn't known existed. Stock portfolios. Real estate holdings. A commercial lease in Austin, Texas. Numbers that didn't make sense at first, and then made a terrible kind of sense. He had been worth far more than she'd ever bothered to understand, and now every dollar of it was legally his and entirely gone. Her phone rang. Her mother, Patricia. Sweetheart, your father tried calling Marcus about their golf weekend. Have you heard from him? He left, Mom. A pause. Careful. Left? What do you mean left? He moved out. Filed paperwork. He's gone. Another pause. Then, honey, you did call him your ex-husband in front of his entire party, in front of everyone. Maybe you just need to give him some time to. You laughed, Mom. You and Dad both laughed. Patricia's voice shifted register in a way Vivian hadn't expected. We thought you were joking. We thought you were playing around, the way couples sometimes do. A beat. But Marcus is not a man who plays around. That man worked hard for this family for 12 years, and you humiliated him in front of 200 people. Her voice tightened. Maybe think about that. The line went dead. Vivian sat in the nursery parking lot surrounded by the business Marcus had built quietly, steadily, without asking for recognition, while she'd been too consumed by her own ladder to notice the empire at her feet. For the first time, she felt something colder than regret. She felt the shape of the mistake. 10 days after the party, a Facebook notification. An acquaintance named Bridget, someone from college she'd barely spoken to in years, had tagged a photo. Location: Austin Convention Center. The caption mentioned a panel discussion at something called the Langford Summit. Vivian opened it. The conference room had 5 people at a long table, nameplates in front of each. Center position: Marcus Hale, Director of Acquisition Strategy, Langford Development Group. He was wearing a charcoal suit she'd never seen, tailored precisely. His hair shorter than she remembered, styled properly. He looked like a man who had found his exact correct place in the world and sat down in it without any effort at all. Next to him sat a woman in a burgundy blazer. Dark hair. The kind of presence that reads as competence before she says a word. Her nameplate: Serena Voss, co-founder and strategic development. They weren't touching, but there was something about the way they occupied the same space, easy, comfortable, like 2 people who'd been operating in sync for a while already, that made Vivian's stomach drop several floors. Bridget's caption: Amazing energy at the Langford Summit. Marcus Hale absolutely killed it talking sustainable growth in secondary markets. Also, who is this woman next to him? Because that is what they call power couple energy. 23 comments. Business professionals congratulating him. Questions about Langford. Someone named Trevor writing, Marcus, great seeing you. That Austin project is going to flip the market. Drinks next week. Vivian set her phone face down on the table. Marcus had spent the same 10 days she'd spent trying to reach him, building a life that had absolutely no place for her in it. She looked around her house, the house she now owned entirely, the house he'd maintained and improved for years, the roof that needed replacing, the foundation issues he'd mentioned in passing that she hadn't bothered to process. The house wasn't a gift. It was a weight, and she was already underwater. Her phone buzzed again. An email from the city's code enforcement office. Drainage issues at her property address. Neighboring properties affected. Remediation required immediately. Estimated cost $8,500. Non-compliance would result in daily fines. She opened her banking app and looked at her balance. After mortgage and bills, she had $12,000. He had known about the drainage, about the roof, about all of it, and he documented everything before he walked out. This wasn't abandonment, it was strategy. She'd called him a man with no future while he'd been quietly building one, methodically, piece by piece. And now she was holding the bill. Remember that in the description and in the pinned comment you have all our supplements, from fitness to overall health in every sense of the word. Take care of yourself the way Marcus took care of his future. 3 weeks to the day after the party, a number she didn't recognize appeared on her phone. Chicago area code. She almost didn't answer. Mrs. Wade? A man's voice, measured and professional. This is Howard Pratt from Pratt & Associates. I represent your husband in matters pertaining to your marital dissolution. Vivian's breath stopped. We're not divorcing. I have paperwork here that suggests otherwise. Mr. Hale filed for legal separation on April 20th. Under Illinois statute, there's a 6-month waiting period before conversion to full dissolution. We're simply following the procedure as outlined. April 20th, 3 days before the party. He had filed 3 days before she stood at that podium. I need to speak with him, she said, hating how her voice sounded. Can you give me his number, an address? I'm not authorized to share that information. However, I am authorized to inform you of several matters. A pause. First, Mr. Hale has formally requested that you cease all attempts to contact him through intermediaries, including family members and former professional contacts. She started to interrupt. He continued smoothly. Second, regarding the property currently in your name, Mr. Hale had a comprehensive professional inspection completed in January. You'll be receiving a full copy of that report within the week. The total repair estimates come to approximately $32,000. He wanted you to have complete and accurate information. The floor tilted slightly. Third, the attorney said, his voice carrying the careful tone of a man about to deliver news he's delivered many times before. Mr. Hale has identified certain irregularities in your joint financial history, specifically credit card accounts opened in his name during the marriage, without his knowledge or consent. The outstanding balance on those accounts is approximately $41,000. Vivian said nothing. Mr. Hale is prepared not to pursue criminal charges for identity fraud, provided you agree to the following terms. You retain the property and all associated liabilities. He retains his business assets, investments, and retirement accounts. No alimony, no claims on future income. Clean and final. And if I decline? Her voice barely reached a whisper. He files a police report. The documentation is substantial. Purchase records, account opening confirmations, time-stamped transactions placing the account activity during periods he was out of town. The evidence would likely support criminal prosecution. She'd opened the cards 2 years ago during a rocky stretch at her firm. New wardrobe for job interviews, money for the networking dinners that were supposed to lead somewhere. She'd told herself she'd pay them off before he noticed. The job stabilized, the ambition took over, and somehow the balances had kept growing while she kept not looking at them. "I'll sign," she whispered. There was a pause on the line. When the attorney spoke again, his voice had dropped its professional precision. "Mrs. Wade, off the record, I've practiced family law for nearly 30 years. Most men in Mr. Hale's situation respond with destruction. They want scorched earth. He didn't do that. He documented everything, protected himself legally, and structured an exit that keeps you out of a courtroom." He paused again. "That's not punishment. That's restraint." "He's making sure I feel it," Vivian said. "No, ma'am, he's making sure he doesn't. There's a significant difference." The line went dead. Vivian sat at her kitchen table surrounded by papers she couldn't afford to address and a silence that had taken the shape of everything she'd thrown away. He hadn't just left her. He'd left her exactly where her choices had been leading all along. That same evening, her brother Owen called. He was 2 years younger, taught high school history in a town an hour south. They talked maybe 3 or 4 times a year, usually around holidays. "I heard about Marcus," he said without setup. "Who told you?" "Mom, she's worried." A pause. "I'm calling because there's something I need to say to you that you're not going to want to hear." Vivian waited. "Marcus was a good man, Viv, a genuinely good man. Better than you were willing to see." The words landed hard. "Owen, you don't—" "I was at that party," he said. "I heard what you said. I watched Dad laugh, and I watched Marcus's face." His voice steadied. "I followed him out to the parking lot, caught him before he pulled out of the space." Vivian's chest tightened. "What did he say?" He said, "Tell your sister I hope she finds someone who fits the life she's building. I'm done trying to make myself small enough to fit hers." Owen exhaled. Then he shook my hand and said I'd always been fair to him, and he drove away. No anger, no drama, just done. "I didn't mean to hurt him. That's the part that's actually worse." Owen's voice was quiet but firm. "You hurt him without even meaning to. That means you'd stopped thinking about him at all. I've watched you do it for years. The way you introduced him at family things like he was an afterthought. The way you talked about his work like it was a hobby he'd grow out of. The way you corrected him in front of people, like you were editing him in real time." He paused. "You know what he built for Mom and Dad's anniversary? A garden at their house. Designed it himself, sourced native plants, put it in with his own hands and maintained it for 3 years. You told people Mom had hired a landscaper." Vivian closed her eyes. She remembered Marcus coming home those evenings with dirt under his fingernails, talking about root structure and soil composition, more animated than she'd seen him in a long time. She'd barely looked at the finished thing. "I'm calling for another reason," Owen said. "Marcus reached out to me last week, asked if I wanted to get dinner next time he's in Chicago. I said yes, because unlike what happened at that party, I actually valued having him in this family. A beat. I'm not choosing sides. I'm choosing what kind of person I want to be. And right now, that means being honest with you. Fix yourself, Viv. Figure out why you needed to make him smaller to feel bigger. Until you do, you're going to keep losing people who were worth keeping. He hung up. Vivian walked to the bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. Expensive dress, professional makeup, the entire architecture of a woman who was winning. She barely recognized any of it. Her phone buzzed. A text from her father. Your mother and I are taking some time away from family dinners for a while. We've been thinking about some things. About how we treated Marcus over the years. We need some time. She slid down the wall and sat on the cold tile floor. And she cried for the first time since the night of the party. 6 weeks after Marcus walked out of that ballroom, an envelope arrived in her mailbox. No return address, postmarked from Austin. Inside, a single sheet of paper and a photograph. The letter was 1 sentence long. I spent 12 years building a life around you. You spent 12 seconds dismantling it. The photograph had been taken at the party. Someone with a good camera and a clear line of sight had caught the exact moment. Vivian at the podium, champagne raised, mouth open mid-laugh. Her parents visible in the background, both grinning, leaning toward each other. And Marcus, standing near the bar in the navy suit she'd picked out for him 2 years ago, holding his glass, not laughing, not smiling, not even looking at her, looking through her, past her, toward the exit, like he'd already left in every way that counted except the physical one. She hadn't known this photo existed, hadn't known anyone was watching from that angle. She stared at it for an hour. And in that hour, she understood something she'd been protecting herself from understanding. She had been proud of that moment, proud of the laugh she'd gotten, proud of how effortlessly she'd landed the line. She'd felt sharp and successful and ahead of everyone in the room. She'd been performing cruelty and calling it confidence. Remember that in the description and in the pinned comment, you have all our supplements, from fitness to total health in every dimension. Invest in yourself the way Marcus invested in his future. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Stop contacting Marcus through his family. They've made their decision. Please respect it. She typed back. Please tell him I'm sorry. Please. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. No response came. She walked to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the closet, at the empty half that had once belonged to someone who replaced a broken gutter before she'd noticed it was broken, who designed a garden at her parents' house as a gift and never once asked to be thanked for it, who pressed his own shirts and kept the pantry stocked and went to bed alone most nights while she worked late at the office because her ambition was, she'd believed, the most important thing in the room. She found a box on the shelf she hadn't opened in years. Photos from the early part of the marriage. Marcus at 28, laying stone for a garden bed at their first apartment, grinning at the camera. Marcus at 32, covered in dirt from a job site, looking more satisfied than she'd ever given him credit for. Marcus at their anniversary dinner, watching her across the table with an expression she'd stopped noticing somewhere along the way. Not performing love, just feeling it. In every photograph, he was looking at her like she was the fixed point the rest of his life was built around. When had that stopped being something she valued? When had she decided that steadiness was dullness? That quiet competence was something to manage instead of treasure? She found the wedding photo. He'd cried when she walked down the aisle. She remembered that, had found it endearing at the time, then embarrassing a few years later, and then stopped thinking about it entirely. He'd kept every promise he'd made that day. She put the photos back in the box and walked through the house. Every room held evidence of a man who had maintained it, improved it, given it his attention year after year. Fresh paint in the hallway he'd put up last summer. The deck he'd rebuilt from scratch 3 years ago. The garden along the back fence he tended every weekend without asking for acknowledgement. Everywhere she looked, him. Her phone rang. Her boss. Vivian, I need you to come in tomorrow morning. The Baxter account is withdrawing. They cited concerns about our agency's professional image. There's a video circulating from your promotion party. It's getting significant traction online, and it's not doing us any favors. 3 other clients have been in touch. She pulled up the social media search after she hung up. It didn't take long. The video had been posted by someone at the party and had found its audience. Vivian's voice, clear and deliberate. "This is my ex-husband. No college degree, no real future." The comments were what you'd expect. Hundreds of them. People who had already found Marcus's LinkedIn profile, already seen his title at Langford Development, already decided who the hero and the villain were. She'd wanted that room to applaud her. Instead, a recording of the moment had traveled across the internet, and what she'd mistaken for cleverness had become the defining image other people used to understand who she was. She'd lit herself on fire for 12 seconds of laughter, and the fire was still burning. 2 months after the party, she received something she hadn't anticipated. A formal invitation, heavy cardstock, clean design. Langford Development Group was hosting its annual Growth Summit in Austin. Keynote speaker, Marcus Hale, Director of Acquisition Strategy. Her name was printed at the bottom. Table 46. She stared at it for several minutes, turning it over. Why would he send this? Was it an opening? A chance to finally speak? To sit in front of him and say what she'd spent 2 months failing to say through voicemails and unanswered messages? She called the number on the invitation. A pleasant woman on the other end told her that Mrs. Wade was listed as a benefactor guest, part of a standard mailing to significant figures associated with any given speaker. Did Marcus specifically request the invitation? A pause. That information wasn't available. Vivian booked the flight. The hotel was the kind with valet parking and doormen and the soft-lit quiet of institutional wealth. She wore a navy dress, simple and conservative. She found her table, far from the stage, tucked near the kitchen entrance, close enough to the bar that she could hear glasses being collected. Table 46. The room filled fast. Development executives, investment partners, institutional players, people who belonged to the same world as each other and moved through it with the ease of people who'd never questioned whether they belonged. Vivian felt like a visitor. Then the lights shifted. A spot found the stage, and Marcus walked out. What struck her first was how different he carried himself. The charcoal suit fit perfectly. His posture was different. Not performance, just a man taking up the space he was entitled to take up. The room quieted immediately, the way rooms do when someone walks in who doesn't need the room to help them. He looked like a man who had set down something heavy and walked away from where he'd put it. "Thank you for being here," he began. "This year has been one of the more transformative periods in Langford's development. But if I'm being honest with you, it's been more transformative for me personally than professionally." Vivian's hands tightened on the napkin in her lap. "I spent a long time," Marcus continued, "allowing other people's perception of my worth to define how I understood my own value. I made myself smaller, quieter, less visible than I actually was because I thought that was what love looked like. I thought staying in a space where you weren't seen was the same thing as loyalty." He paused, and something in his delivery shifted, slower, more deliberate. "I was wrong about that. Sometimes the people you love most are precisely the ones who cannot see you clearly, and sometimes the most honest thing you can do is stop waiting for them to learn how." The room applauded. Several people nodded. A man at the table next to Vivian said something quiet to his colleague, and they both smiled. Marcus wasn't looking at her, wasn't acknowledging her presence anywhere in the room. But every word felt like it had been calibrated to reach exactly where she was sitting. "This isn't a story about settling scores," he said. "It's about deciding you deserve something real, and then doing the hard, unglamorous work of actually building it." Standing ovation. Genuine. The kind that takes a room a moment to start, then rises before anyone makes a decision about it. Serena Voss joined him on stage. Black dress, composed, the specific kind of presence that belongs in front of large rooms. They stood side by side and began presenting together. Sustainable development strategy, secondary markets, long-term positioning. Their dynamic was obvious to anyone watching. Not performing partnership, actually being in one. Vivian watched from table 46, invisible in the back of a room where everyone else had somewhere to be. She watched him shake hands and receive embraces from people who had found him valuable long before she'd made her punchline. She watched him laugh without checking whether anyone was approving of it. She watched him exist in a life she had never imagined for him because she had never imagined him at all, not fully, not honestly. He hadn't invited her here as a peace offering. He'd invited her to watch exactly what she'd thrown away. She couldn't leave it there. She knew she should. She knew, sitting in that hotel ballroom, that she had no right to anything further. But something she could only describe as desperation had taken hold, and on the flight home it hardened into action. She found Serena Voss's LinkedIn profile, sent a connection request. When it was accepted 2 days later, she composed a message. "Hi, Serena. We haven't been formally introduced. I'm Vivian Hale, Marcus's ex-wife. I think there are things you should know about him before you become more involved. He has significant issues with honesty and commitment. He walked out of our marriage without any warning after 12 years together. He's not who he presents himself to be. I thought you deserved to know." She hit send before she could think it through. 3 hours later, her phone rang. Marcus's number. She answered immediately, her heart filling the space between the first ring and his voice. "Hello, Vivian." Cold, completely even. "What did you send, Serena? I was trying to—" She forwarded it to me immediately. He interrupted her with the same precision he'd brought to everything else. Her word for it was pathetic. Her word for the motivation behind it was transparent, both accurate. "Marcus, please. I just want to talk. I made a terrible mistake. I know that. I know it. Can't we just—" "No." One word, no variation in tone. "You had 12 years to talk. You used them to make it clear what you actually thought of me. You don't get to revise that now because my circumstances have changed." A pause. "I'm filing a restraining order. You'll receive it within the week. Stay away from me. Stay away from Serena. Stay away from anyone connected to my life. This is done. Marcus, please don't. Goodbye, Vivian." 2 days later, a process server handed her the paperwork at her front door. 500 feet. Marcus Hale, Serena Voss, Langford Development Group Properties. Her attorney looked it over and put it on the table between them. "You contacted his business partner after the divorce proceedings explicitly asked you not to contact him through third parties," he said. "That's harassment as defined under state statute. If you violate this order, proximity, contact, communication through anyone in his circle, you will face criminal charges on top of the civil exposure you already have." He closed the folder. "My professional advice is simple. Move on. You have lost this." Vivian drove home. She sat in the house that was slowly consuming her finances and her reserves and her sense of who she was. Every attempt to find a way back had only produced another door locked from the other side. She had wanted badly to be the author of her own story, the person who earned the spotlight and commanded the room and defined how everyone in it understood themselves relative to her. Instead, she had become the cautionary note in someone else's. At work, things had continued deteriorating quietly. 3 clients gone, a 4th raising concerns. Her boss, professional and careful, had suggested that new opportunities might present themselves elsewhere. Vivian pulled up job listings and found she couldn't feel anything about any of them. The engine that had driven her for 15 years had run out of fuel. She looked at the photograph Marcus had sent, the one from the party, the one that had frozen the moment she'd thought was her finest into something she couldn't look at without recognizing herself for what she'd been in it. Some mistakes can be explained, some can be forgiven. Some you simply have to carry forward, and the only thing they're good for is teaching you, at whatever cost the lesson extracts, not to make them again. She put the photograph in a drawer, not to forget it, to keep it where she'd know it was there. Remember that in the description and in the pinned comment you have all our supplements, from fitness to health in every dimension of the word. Take care of yourself, you deserve that much. 14 months after Marcus walked out of the Riverside Grand, Vivian lived in a 1-bedroom apartment across the city. She'd sold the house, took a loss, came out the other side of it without the weight. The apartment was modest in the way honest things are modest. Nothing performed, nothing maintained for appearances. She could afford it. That was the full extent of what she required of it. She had a new job. Smaller agency, less prestige, less money, but nobody there knew the version of her who'd handed her husband a microphone and used him as her opening act. It was a place where she could be whoever she managed to become. Her phone buzzed. A text from Owen. "Dinner next week. Mom and Dad want to see you." The family had come back together slowly, carefully, over the past year. Her parents had done their own version of a reckoning, sitting with the fact that they had laughed that night, that they had enabled something by finding it funny. They were trying. She was trying. That was what trying looked like from the inside. She'd started seeing a therapist the month after the restraining order arrived, and she'd spent most of those sessions sitting with a single uncomfortable question: why had making Marcus smaller ever felt necessary? The answer that emerged wasn't flattering. She'd been afraid that his quiet competence made her loud ambition look like exactly what it was: performance. She'd been right to be afraid. It had been exactly that. She opened his company's website on her laptop, not out of obsession but out of something closer to honesty, wanting to see the full shape of what she'd had. Langford Development had expanded into 3 new markets. Marcus was now VP of Strategic Growth. His biography photo showed a man who looked genuinely at ease in his own face. Next to the company news section was an announcement. Langford Development co-founders Serena Voss and VP Marcus Hale are pleased to announce their engagement. The wedding is planned for next spring. Vivian read it twice. She expected to feel the spike of something sharp and didn't. What she found instead was something quieter. A recognition, clear and without drama. He had found someone who looked at him the way he'd once looked at her. Someone who built things alongside him instead of treating his building as a background detail in her own story. She closed the laptop. Her phone rang. Her boss. "Vivian, the Henderson pitch you delivered yesterday, they loved it. 2-year contract, well done." "Thank you," she said, quietly. Meant it, small victories. That was what her therapist called them. Not the landmark moments, not the grand arrivals, but the steady daily work of being someone you didn't have to flinch away from in the mirror. She walked to the small balcony of her apartment and looked out over the city. Somewhere out there, Marcus was building a life with a woman who deserved everything he brought to it. And in here, for the first time in longer than she could honestly account for, she was building something too. Not the version she'd imagined standing under chandeliers with a champagne glass in her hand and a room applauding. Something smaller than that, quieter, more real. She'd been given 12 years of steady, genuine love, and she'd traded it for 12 seconds of a laugh that still found her in her sleep. There are lessons you learn the hard way, and there are lessons you learn the hardest way, the way where you don't get to take the test again, where the cost is permanent and the only thing left to do with it is grow. That was what she was trying to do. Grow. Become someone, finally, who wouldn't need to tear anyone down to feel like she was standing up. It wasn't the ending she'd imagined, but it was the one she'd earned. And somewhere in the gap between who she'd been and who she was becoming, she was learning that maybe honest endings, the real, unglamorous, quietly hopeful kind, are worth more than the perfect ones, even when you have to lose everything to understand that.